Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
This was the week when COVID-19 got real in Russia. Confirmed cases are now over 1,000, which is still suspiciously low. In a nationally televised speech, Vladimir Putin postponed the April 22nd constitutional amendment referendum, and Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin has been placed in charge of the national response. So what happens when an authoritarian kleptocracy that has relied on subterfuge, smoke and mirrors, kabuki theater, and dramaturgy has to deal with a global health crisis that doesn't care about propaganda? What happens when Putinism meets a pandemic? Hello from my condo in Adams Morgan in Washington, D.C., where I am observing federal and local self-isolation guidelines, and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Don.
Hi, Brian. Good to be back with you.
Good to have you back. Also joining us from her home in DuPont Circle in our nation's capital is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Brian.
So it's been pretty much conventional wisdom that this crisis is going to change everything and everybody. The world after COVID-19 is going to be a very different place from the world before. And Russia, of course, is no exception. Along these lines, I came across a very interesting piece by Alexander Yakovenko, the former chairman of the Russian Journalists Union and a State Duma deputy back in the 1990s, noting that COVID-19 has now surpassed Putin as the lead story on state-controlled news broadcasts in Russia. Yakovenko notes that Russian media made, on average, 114,000 references to COVID-19 every day last week, compared to only 16,000 for Putin and only 9,000 to the Russian Constitution. Maria, in the very early weeks of the pandemic, the assumption was that it would help Putin because it would give him a legitimate excuse to suppress opposition demonstrations, but that was before things kind of got real. In addition to being a threat to lives and livelihoods, is COVID-19 also becoming a threat to Putin's unquestioned supremacy?
Excellent question, Brian. So the problem is we are quite early into the development of this situation, and in the long term, it's a little bit hard to tell. So let's look at what we've got. Putin actually gave this address to the population yesterday about new situation in the country and offered some measures to fight with it. Last time we met, we actually discussed how this reaction and response to this pandemic by two autocratic regimes, China and Russia, seem to be quite different. China is very efficient, fast. Russia is unfortunately none of those things, it seems. And in some ways, this is also straightforward from the measures that Putin offered in his address. They seem to be quite chaotic. There is, under good tradition that Russia has been, Russian government has been imposing lately, has been developing lately, is increasing taxes. Which also is very chaotic because there was a lot of discussion. No one quite understood what exactly it is that they will be taxing. At the same time, there is some payment increases for sick leaves and for unemployment benefits. So that is a little bit reminiscent of the Western approaches. But at the same time, also there's a bunch of measures that are all kind of targeted at isolated social groups, and they don't really mix together very nicely. It's still not clear overall if there will be a nationwide quarantine or not. Right now, it's a vacation for a week that Putin offered for the population, but it's not clear, again, if this social distancing or quarantine measures are going to be enforced during the vacation or not. Overall, for now at least, Putin does not really communicate a vision of strength and resilience in face of this disease. And in the short term, it's definitely not going to be good for his approval. In the longer term, however, there is a tendency of people in all societies to unite around the leadership when times are bad. In some ways, you see something similar happening right now with Donald Trump approval ratings, despite all the criticism, actually jumping up lately. And we are probably going to see that in Russia at some point as well.
I mean, does it bring Don into the conversation here? I mean, yeah, when you look at the very specific you look at the minutiae of the response, it looks almost standard, quite frankly. But the larger, broader question is that, how can this authoritarian, kleptocratic model of governance that we have in Russia respond to this crisis? In a lot of ways, this is a test. And you have to wonder if this, as I said in my introductory remarks, this regime that's relied on smoke and mirrors and kabuki theater and propaganda is equipped to handle this. And if this is going to be a severe test of this model of governance. Don, what do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, I very much agree with Maria's points, but let me make a couple others which basically bolster what you said. And I refer to our friend Vladimir Milov's article today, where he talks about just what Maria said, which is these responses have been rather middling. They've been rather mild. A vacation is not a quarantine. And I would go beyond that and say that I thought to some extent they seemed flat-footed and clunky in their response. There's been a lot of bureaucratic infighting, I think, and that surprised me because you think of Russia as a power vertical, Brian, and I think the Chinese response has been a lot more effective. And so I think there has been a fig leaf uncovered a little bit, and you see a lot of open bureaucratic infighting and miscommunication and mixed messages, which I think do not, as Maria said, help Putin over the short term. The final point I would make preliminarily is that I thought the way that people had their breath taken away by the Chinese and Russian response to what's going on in Italy was sort of seemed efficient and quick for Moscow, much quicker than they were with their own people. And that, to me, the timing, maybe it's just optics, seemed different. And finally, I would say that I think the Victory Day, and I sent the website around today to you guys, the Victory Day, the referendum, and that stuff is, I think, still above all the major preoccupation. So this is sort of an annoyance and a distraction from what they really want. Now, we'll get into that, I know, so I'll stop there.
Well, yeah, no, I think I do get the impression that at least from the very top, they're looking at this as an annoyance and a distraction from all the things they're going to do. But it's not. This is a global pandemic and a global health crisis. There's another thing I noticed today also that struck me, I would put in the category of potential threats to the regime, and that is the reaction of Sochi after Putin announced the week-long vacation. The authorities in Sochi asked Russians not to go to Sochi for their vacation, which makes one wonder. Yeah. I mean,
typical Russia.
The recorded cases are still largely concentrated in Moscow. I mean, apparently the safest place in the world right now is Siberia, because there's very few cases in Siberia, or very few recorded confirmed cases in Siberia. We actually don't know how many actual cases in Siberia. Another thing that caught my eye this week, it was actually pretty important on this, is that Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, has been assigned to oversee the national response to this. Our good friend Mark Galeotti had an op-ed this week saying it's a case study of late Putinism's crisis management and whether Sobyanin will be allowed to succeed, what it will mean, whether it kind of gets into the Kremlinology of all of this, whether this will just be another thing to have a clan war around, or whether Sobyanin, by all accounts, who is actually a pretty competent administrator, whether he'll be allowed to succeed. Maria, how do you see that? Because I find this piece of it very interesting.
On your earlier point, Brian, by the way, may I tell the new joke that I just read this morning that I thought is hilarious? That in Russia, they conducted over 100,000 tests for coronavirus, and all of them demonstrated that Putin supported the nullification of the terms of Vladimir Putin, and he's staying in power. So it kind of tells you, and when you read these jokes, it tells you where the public opinion is. They're all very anti-Kremlin, very anti-state. There's zero belief that the authority is actually going to be efficient. But there is one sign, however, and this is why I disagree a little bit, that the Kremlin does not perceive the seriousness of the situation. I think they're awakening, and they did, at least for now, canceled or delayed this public, quote-unquote, referendum that was originally scheduled for April 22nd. We know that was of extreme importance to Putin, and remember how much he was in a rush with all these constitutional amendments to pass them real quick, so that actually had looked horribly and totally not legitimate. But there was this rush, and all of a sudden, they actually right now forced to reschedule this vote. I think that actually signals that they start awakening to this situation, or at least something that we need to pay attention to. It is, of course, possible they will just cancel that vote altogether, because as Pamfilova, the head of the Electoral Commission in Russia, said, by existing laws, Putin is already, the constitution has already been approved, the new constitution changes are already in place. And the irony is that by rescheduling this vote, Putin himself violated his own law about this vote, because by this law, he cannot just say, cancel it and say it will have sometime in the future. He actually has to set up a specific date in the future, and he didn't do that. So it's funny how they're creating their own laws for God knows what reasons, and they then 5 minutes later they violate their own laws that they just wrote.
Well, that's something new, huh?
Well, that's a good point, yeah. On your question about Sobyanin, I think it's a very interesting development to watch, but mostly that tells us, as we know, that Sobyanin is perceived as a very efficient manager, and that's true, right? He had that reputation back in Siberia, that's why he was called in Moscow, and he certainly showed that in Moscow itself, his management of Moscow is considered a success. So I think he is given this authority right now because it's thought that he can handle it. The question is, will he be able to handle the success if it comes afterwards, for all the right reasons that you outlined? Because Sobyanin definitely may be perceived as a challenger for Putin in the future. So that will be something interesting to watch.
Yeah, if I could add, Maria, I agree. I mean, I thought Mark overstated the case a little bit, but, a week and a half ago, it was Galifova, and then it went to 3 working groups, and now it seems to be Sobyanin. And if he fails, it's a problem for him politically, and if he succeeds, it could be a problem for him or the others. I absolutely agree. On the referendum, I raised the point that again, that they did postpone it, but I think Putin gains legitimacy by even successfully handling a state of emergency, which we all know they're discussing and have been for the last several days. Just a separate point, Brian, on the case lists, I would be extremely curious to see what the rate is in the military. And I've seen nothing about that. Perhaps either of you have, but I would suspect it's pretty bad there.
Well, there have been some very interesting reports out there about how this is actually affecting engagement on the front lines in the Donbass. And also, as I noted in our SIPA virtual panel yesterday about COVID and the Syria crisis, the Russian Defense Ministry has put out new rules about engagement in contact with soldiers from kind of other nations in the Syria conflict. That would be with Turkey, Syria, and Iran, of course. And it's wars and pandemics together are lethal combinations, obviously, but social distancing and military actions, quite frankly, are extremely difficult. One has to wonder how this is going to play out on that. That would be actually an interesting discussion for a whole podcast.
I was glad yesterday in your discussion you brought this up with regard to Syria and what the conditions might be like there. And for those who listen to the podcast, it's worth going back to that discussion. I'm going to be coming out with something next week, as you know, Brian, on the cases, the situation in the Donbass, which I'm working on.
Yeah, no, that's very. And our former colleagues at RFERL had a very interesting report on how this is affecting the front lines in the Donbass.
Yeah, exactly.
This week. So, anything else on the Kremlinology of this? Because I find the Sobyanin thing really fascinating. My first reaction to it, very similar to Mark's, was that is he being set up to fail? Or is the appointment of him something that is basically a recognition of the seriousness of this? Because, Sobyanin and Dmitry Kozak, in my opinion, are probably the two most, leaving aside all moral judgments about the ends of what they do, I consider them both to be extremely competent administrators. Their track record in Sobyanin's case, first in Siberia, later in Moscow, and Kozak's case, first in Siberia, in St. Petersburg, and later at the national level, it speaks for itself. They're both extremely competent administrators. I don't agree with the ends of what they're trying to do, but the appointment of Sobyanin struck me as like, all right, this could be a recognition that this is really serious, and they're going to put one of their most steady and most experienced hands on it. On the other hand, Sobyanin has a lot of enemies.
Well, he should, Brian, he should go out and look at that new Zhukov statue and see what happens when you get too big.
Yes, exactly. And one has to wonder, and it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't moment. Maria, any additional thoughts on Sobyanin before we move on to other aspects of this?
To me, it's a recognition of the seriousness. That's all I have to say. I think they're awakening to the situation, and they're appointing, as I said, the good manager to resolve it. That's how we would say.
For the sake of the Russian people, I hope you're right. But I afraid with what we all know about how Russia operates, I'm a little bit skeptical on that.
And on Putin's measures, I just wanted to add that I don't think that you mentioned, Brian, that they're actually not necessarily new compared to everyone else is doing worldwide. But it's important to point out that Russia does not introduce this universal quarantine or social distancing. It introduced this week of vacation, which actually puts the cost for the implemented measures on business. In this sense, if you are a businessman, if it's an announced vacation, you have still to pay people salary and you can fire anyone because it's not an emergency situation yet. Same goes when it comes to the so-called announced taxation measures, right? We don't really know who is going to be so they first said that anyone who has over $1 million of rubles in their banks, but this can be estimated differently. It can be in total of your bank deposits that sum up to 1 million, or only one total deposit that has exactly 1 million rubles in the bank. So, and the problem is that ministers of Russia, they disagree with each other. The commentators and the representatives of the Russian state, they disagree with each other in the comments when it comes to the implementations of these measures. So it's all of it actually looks quite chaotic, not well thought through, and most importantly, it hurts business more than anything else. This, unfortunately, is the realities of the Russian state. To be fair, there is other measures that are introduced that are designed to help the business a little bit, but overall, this does not look as a consistent set of well-thought measures. And unfortunately, a lot of things that the Russian state has been doing lately looks around as the constitutional amendments, the way they were implemented, they all the steps, they look chaotic and not well thought through. This is indicative to me of the fact that the regime is becoming more vulnerable, old, that policy making and decision making is not very well developed and not very consistent.
I want to now, along those lines, kind of shift to the numbers game right now. My colleagues at RFERL had a really good report this week. Big shout out to them on what exactly is going on with the numbers. A piece by my former colleague Mike Eckel at RFERL in collaboration with the RFERL's Russian service. And one of the things that really jumped out about me in this piece is the testing. And this seems to be the problem everywhere in the world. You have to have an accurate picture of what you're dealing with, and that all depends on the test. And up until now, the tests have been going to the state-funded laboratory in Novosibirsk known by the shorthand name Vector. And the results of this test have been just like not very reliable, according to this report and according to the Russian science blog PCR News. Which looked at specific tests and said it only detects the virus at a certain threshold in the sample. So there's a problem with that. So Russia could be running into the same problem a lot of the rest of the world is running to. Also, at the same time, this Committee to Protect Journalists has put out a call on Russia to stop censoring the media in terms of giving an accurate picture on this. Maria, what's your sense? Are we looking at a case of intentional fudging of the numbers by the authorities, or is Russia just running into the normal problems in testing that other parts of the world are running into?
First of all, as we have discussed last time, the Russian regime always silences unpleasant things, especially authoritarian regimes. And that's what Putin has been doing since the start of his career as a president or even prime minister of Russia. So that certainly is there. At the same time, there is an issue with the Russian tests. A lot of observers, as you have pointed out, Brian, have mentioned that, in fact, the Russian tests are not very sensitive. So they are likely also underreporting the real actual number of cases. Since early on. Plus, they have been really introduced with a delay. So that's another factor that definitely is going to be decreasing the overall numbers. In general, last time we mentioned that the state has already been trying to silence voices that try raising awareness about the situation and try introduce fines and administrative punishments for people who, quote unquote, spreads this disinformation. Right now, it's discussed that the new changes of this kind will be introduced in the criminal law of the Russian Federation. Again, increasing the punishment for people who spread those fake news, unreliable information. And they already created a special operation group in the investigative committee in order to fight this situation. So overall, we are facing here, I think, double-edged situation of the state that's very much disinclined for the real news, for the real information to spread across the country, in combination with a medical system that's just weak and is unable to implement the tests that are adequate in identifying, to develop and administer both, right? The tests that, first of all, they underreport the number of the diseases, and second of all, they just don't cover nowhere near anyone who needs to pass this test.
It seems to me, Don, we have almost a perfect storm here. We've got a regime that instinctively, its default reaction is to suppress bad news at a time when the population really needs accurate information. You have a regime that never lets a crisis go to waste in terms of like trying to suppress its population. And I can't help but look skeptically at these crocodile tears about fake news right now. I mean, Don, it kind of reminds me to a degree of, in a little bit different way, of Chernobyl. I mean, it's one of these things that's going to
Good comparison.
Of the system. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, good comparison. I think, why let a good tragedy go to waste? If I can be morbid. Maria, wasn't there talk too this week about shutting down the internet? I just read that in passing. It is like Chernobyl, Brian, but I think the system now is probably a bit more resilient than the Soviet Union was 4 or 5 years in advance. But we have to see. Again, I repeat my point earlier. You saw the fig leaf come down on a lot of things they've been able to fudge about and lie about. And I think this will have a lasting damage on the regime, just not at Chernobyl in terms of its immediacy.
Well, yeah, and just kind of a heads up to our listeners. I mean, next week I'm planning a special podcast about the world after COVID, kind of to look at what it looks like and to look at different aspects of that with different in-house experts here at SIPA. Stay tuned for that, and we'll get into that next week.
One more thing, Brian.
Yeah, sure.
I saw a Levada poll this morning, which said had the Russian population relatively split about the obnulenia, and I found that very interesting. So you've got an emergency situation where, as Maria correctly said, you tend to rally around the leaders, but they still seem ambivalent about the constitutional changes. And there's a tension there that I can't yet figure out.
Yeah, no, I don't. The timing, in my opinion, couldn't have been worse for this regime in terms of what it wants to do right now. It's really complicating this thing that they really wanted to get, done and dusted really quickly and with as little fanfare as possible to get these changes in place. And now they're not going to be able to do that at least in the way they wanted to. Another thing that I've noticed this week that again was predictable and is also but just as nevertheless very interesting is that just as it was the case with past disasters in Russia, civil society is kind of stepping up into the gap that's being left by the states. We're seeing independent activist groups gearing up on this. Maria, you're our resident follower of all things Russian civil society here. Are you encouraged by this? Does this kind of, if we're kind of thinking down the road, and we'll get into this a lot deeper next week, but do you see a kind of a harbinger of things to come that you could have this could lead and reinvigorate civil society as it did in the past back in, remember the forest fires back in, was it 2010? 2010. And other things. Remember Dr. Lisa and other kind of civic activists kind of came to public prominence. How do you see this playing out?
It's a very interesting point, Brian. It's true that in Russia, the weakness, the civil society kind of forced commonly to act to compensate for the weakness and inefficiency of the state that typically is late in the game. Although I do have to point out that after this forced situation, again, originally it seemed like a total catastrophe, but in the long run, actually the areas where the state has been able to provide at least some support, probably too late in the game and probably insufficient, there was actually a substantive increase in approval for the president for the Kremlin. There's actually even a great academic article about that. So people, unfortunately, are not very rational in this situation. And as I said, this is my warning that when, no matter what support is manifested, in times like this, in the times of crisis, people will have a tendency to unite around the leadership. That's one potential counterpoint. At the same time, we do definitely see, I mentioned already the jokes that have been spreading around the internet that demonstrate that there is zero belief in the effectiveness of the Russian state when it comes to the fight with coronavirus. There is also the polls by Levada Center that demonstrate that the majority of the Russians do not trust the official information being spread by the Russian media. So people who said, there's a quarter of respondents who said they totally do not trust this information, and 35% in addition said they only partly trust information that's being communicated by the state-owned media. So you have about 60% of the population, 2/3, who are quite skeptical about what are they being told by the media, and who is going to, let's face it, who is going to blame them. So the opposition has been critical so far of the measures that Putin has introduced to fight this coronavirus situation, and also the fact that the constitutional amendments vote has been delayed gives them a little bit of time to maybe finally agree on one unified strategy in the future if we ever were to get this right for demonstrations back, right? And that's another concern, of course. There is this civic society side that will try to mobilize the population, try to substitute for the areas where the state will inevitably fail. But there is also the danger that the state will now use this emergency situation that Dan has mentioned and this ban on public activities, mass activities, in order to essentially further its dictatorial or authoritarian rule. So in the long term, we will see definitely the fight between those two streams. I have to mention, though, the economic situation has been worsening in Russia in the first place. It's very likely to get much, much, much worse now that it's not just domestic Russian crisis, but also spreading across the world. And in the long run, this doesn't look good for the Kremlin.
We actually wanted to bring some, actually along the lines of the civic activists in your hometown of St. Petersburg, where you and I met, God, decades and decades ago when I was a lot younger, and so are you. Alexandra Krylenkova, well-known human rights activist out of Petersburg. She's most recently known for her helping the defendants in the so-called network or Siet case. There was she also has exposed human rights abuses in Crimea. She has now set up a group called Solidarnost, which is kind of combining COVID and the Russian word for solidarity, Solidarnost. And it's a grassroots group that includes activists, lawyers, doctors, psychologists, computer programs to aim and identify, network, and assist local initiative groups across the country. I mean, this looks like a pretty powerful initiative. I don't know if you know Alexandra. I don't know her personally. I know of her, and I know her to be one of the more competent and energetic civil society activists in Russia right now. I mean, how do you see this? This is something coming out of your very own hometown.
St. Petersburg and Moscow, actually shocked me in the summer by the level of increase in civic activism. At the time, it was mostly provoked by the state very harsh breakdown on the mass demonstrations in support of free and fair election, and the level and degree of this development of the social networks, physical networks on the ground between different activists and how many people actually participated, it was stunning. In Moscow, they actually have very efficient chains. Once everyone is arrested, like there is this, spread of information very quickly across all these people, and that person sitting in the police department, in the police department, for example, they start bringing medication, some first aid, some food, maybe something to sleep on and things like that, to the extent that people had to actually announce not to bring things anymore because there were too many people providing these goods. This is clearly a development of the same, of what we already saw in big cities, and it's a very, very positive development that's definitely encouraging. In the long term, we see the society is awakening, particularly in big cities. So St. Petersburg and Moscow are great examples. Unfortunately, the situation is not as great in smaller towns. So there, we're going to have to wait for that to come. But I agree, and it's a very important point to make, that this is going to be an opportunity to foster these developments for sure. Because once again, no one's really thinking that the Kremlin is going to be quite effective, except for Sobyanin, maybe, right? But we don't really expect the Kremlin to be effective on the ground anywhere besides Moscow.
And one wonders if the authorities are going to try to co-opt groups like Solidarnost for its own purposes, because that is always possible. And again, I can't not mention that, again, a nice shout out to my former colleagues at Radio Svoboda for what I thought was a fantastic report on Solidarnost this week. So if my friends in Prague at RFE are listening, nice job on that. Don, any thoughts on this, on the civic activism?
No, who would be to disagree with our friend Maria from St. Petersburg? She's the expert. I agree. I think it's too early to tell. I think that in my own case, the tendency is always to default to the late 80s, as you and I, Brian, have talked about many times. So it's important to realize how this is different. And I do think the reserves of regime strength are stronger now. But can I say a point about the system? We've talked about what the system would look like after the Ukraine mobilization. I think Snegovaya talked in January in a good article about the coming to the fore of managers and the new government in Mishustin. And I agree that the system is evolving and perhaps in a new direction. But following up on what we said this afternoon, I think it may be in an authoritarian direction. I don't think these so-called managers are going to do it for what Russia needs at the moment.
Well, that is actually an excellent subject for a future podcast about whether this strengthens the managers or whether it strengthens the ideologues. That's actually a fantastic subject of this. Going back to Don, I know you and I, we always like to default to when we were young, and we were younger in the late 80s. But that said, I would say that, a lot of people who became household names, our good friend, the late Boris Nemtsov, emerged as a civil society activist from the fledgling Soviet civil society activist. He was a physicist in Nizhny Novgorod and emerged as a.
I think that might have been a couple of years after, Brian, but I don't remember exactly. But you're absolutely right about these leaders emerge out of nowhere. Yeltsin being primarily.
Yeltsin was a party figure, but the non-party figure that made him emerged. He was an academic, and he emerged as a civil society activist on, if I'm not mistaken, environmental and nuclear safety issues following Chernobyl, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly.
That's something we all need to bear in mind. And on that note, it's probably a good way to segue into our second half as I look at the clock and see it ticking away. So I'd like to, in a few moments, we will continue our discussion and shift gears to foreign affairs, where, not surprisingly, Moscow is, of course, trying to use the crisis to drive a wedge into NATO. I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA, and joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from her home in DuPont Circle, just down the hill from mine, in our nation's capital, is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. So last weekend, Russia sent 600 ventilators and 100 military virologists and epidemiologists to Italy, following talks between President Vladimir Putin and Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte. The move came as the European Union and NATO appeared to be struggling to forge a coordinated response. And the move appeared to be a geopolitical move by Russia, asserting Russian power and exerting influence. The Russian move, as well as similar ones by China, are exposing fears that authoritarian states could use the COVID-19 crisis to advance their international ambitions. In an excellent article this week by SIPA President Alina Polyakova, she wrote, quote, "The epidemic has highlighted existing vulnerabilities in transatlantic defense and security, and that authoritarian states are taking advantage of the chaos to exploit societal divisions, sow confusion, and ultimately undermine democratic cohesion." At the same time, however, some even in Italy are calling out the Russian move as little more than Pakazuka, just for show. An unidentified Italian official told La Stampa that, quote, 80% of Russian supplies are totally useless or of little use to Italy. In short, this is nothing more than a pretext. Don, your thoughts?
I think the Italians are pretty serious. They're good at picking out hypocrisy, and I think I was gratified to see that they saw right through it. But the Russians have gotten credit for the optics of the so-called assistance, and I think that credit will last for a while, even if the Italians are already wising up. Second, I think it does. I think Dr. Polyakova is right. It does very much show the vulnerabilities of the system, which its slowness to react, it's all those things we always have given Putin credit for, the ability to react to a situation. They're not showing to be very effective. A lot of it is optics, but optics matter too, and I think there's something to worry about. Again, I refer to our discussion between China and Russia on a SIPA event earlier, which is to say they have different resources to bear. The way they have and have not interacted in Europe and come to so-called assistance has been very interesting to watch. And to some extent, as our friend Edward Lucas said, they have learned from each other's playbooks.
Maria, your thoughts on this? I mean, how do you see Russia's, as Russia struggles to get a grip on this at home, they seem to actually be on top of their game in exploiting it in terms of driving wedges between the West and making the West look bad. Again, and in fairness to the European Union and NATO, their response has not been as ineffectual as it has been portrayed, but the optics of it have been. There's this impression out there that the EU has been slow to, and they have been slow to respond to it, but not as ineffectual as the popular perception suggests. NATO, on the other hand, is actually a military alliance, which isn't really geared to fight pandemics. But that said, Russia seems to be on top of its game and exploiting these weaknesses in the West. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that we are judging and accusing the EU and other international institutions of inaction just a little bit too fast. From my experience watching these situations and how the EU typically responds to crisis, even if you think of Ukrainian crisis, right? They're really slow to react because they are really facing all these collective action problems. It's hundreds of bureaucrats having to take the decision as opposed to literally one person only in Russian case, right? So it's inevitable that there is always a delay, and I think what we are witnessing right now is that the international community and the transatlantic alliance actually catching up slowly, just as you said, Brian. So when it comes to Russia, honestly, the whole Italian situation originally, like last week, looked quite nicely. But after Stampa, the Italian publication, as you mentioned, they actually published this really strong rebuttal towards actually delivered to Italy that the aid is mostly unusable, and instead of doctors, Russia said military pretty much. So we are facing another green man situation, right? That is actually not looking very good to Russia. And in the long run, I don't think it's going to be able to really fundamentally alternate its image. So the situation with Stampa's effect, the effect of yesterday's Stampa publication was so huge that, I don't know if you've seen that, today the Embassy of Russia actually sent an official protest to La Stampa with regards to its publication about Russia's aid. So this is all getting ridiculously out of control, I think. And most importantly, I think it signals that the Europeans are not, even Italians, who have historically been more pro-Russian than most other European countries, right, as compared to Poland, for example. Even Italians are quite skeptical about Russian aid. This all honestly does not, looks like it helps Russia very much, even if, again, as you said, make no mistake, we know that Russia is going to be using this situation for its own benefit. Russia's senators, journalists have used this as a great pretext to spread more fake news. For example, Alexei Pushkov, a senator, he accused Poland of blocking the aid being sent to Italy, and what kind of monsters would do that? Later, it was all refuted as wrong fake news, fake information, but of course he never apologized for that. Observers also noticed that there is a huge increase in the number of trolls and bots to publications that are concerning this anything regarding your response to coronavirus. Italian media, blogs, there is huge increase of trolls and bots who all write essentially, who are very, very supportive of Russia, very critical of the European Union, and all write with with a lot of mistakes in the Italian language. So essentially, we observe the typical disinformation campaign that Russia implements. I think Russia is most efficient early on when everything's in disarray and like no one really understands what's going on, and then Russia kind of jumps in and it can use its moment of uncertainty to its own advantage. Once again, we saw it in Ukraine, and we somewhat saw it early on in the beginning of this crisis. But I think right now the international community is awakening to the situation, and in the long term, Russia is not going to be able to benefit much from it, especially as the crisis worsens. The measures that the Russian government takes to combat the disease at home will become increasingly obvious that they're not inadequate. And for example, as one of the publications yesterday estimated in Russia by Dossier, Center Dossier, it's a really good respected publication in Russia, without emergency actions in Russia, up to 60-70% will be infected in the next 3-4 months. As we see more of that development in Russia, more bad news are coming. Unfortunately, I'm afraid the disinformation is not going to be very successful in this sense.
No, I would agree with you on that, Maria. I mean, as the situation gets worse in Russia, it's going to be much tougher to exploit this thing abroad. A couple of quick thoughts on this. The fact that the Russian embassy in Italy actually issued their protest to La Stampa, in a lot of ways represents progress. Because I actually remember a case back in the 1990s when a Canadian newspaper, I forget which one, it was either the National Post or the Globe and Mail, but they published an article very critical of Russia, and the Russia summoned the Canadian ambassador and issued their protest to the Canadian government as if the Canadian government could tell the Canadian free press what to do. At least now they understand where to direct their protest in such a case. A second thought on the response of the West. I mean, actually, this was, as I was watching the EU response, I couldn't help but remember comments a couple of years ago made by former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, a good friend of SIPA's, where he said the problem with the EU is it's effectively it's a confederation. It's not a federation. And historically, confederations do not survive. Either they become federations, as was the case with the United States, or they cease to exist as confederations. And I think this crisis may be the test of this, because as a confederation, the EU's tools to respond to this are actually limited, because they're dependent upon I mean, look at even the case of a federation, the United States, and the problems that are now coming to play between the federal government and the state governments in the U.S. So that's one. There is a structural barrier to the EU mounting an effective response. There is also a structural and mission barrier effectively with NATO, as NATO being a military alliance. And I've long argued that NATO's mission needs to be kind of retooled and to deal with kinetic threats as well as non-kinetic threats. So you may want to bring out, I've long advocated bringing finance ministers and law enforcement, attorneys general and prosecutors into the kind of NATO ministerials. Maybe you want to start thinking about health ministers as well as pandemics kind of turn into global national security threat. Don, your thoughts on this?
I think no one has thought of NATO's out-of-area responsibilities ever being medical, and I think, as you say, this is going to correctly test it. I wanted to add and conclude, I know we're getting to the end, with an issue of great interest to a lot of us Russian security geeks, which is to say, can Russia, I expect a serious economic setback for Russia from this, and can Russia sustain even the kind of more limited engagement abroad in some of the places where it's playing around. This is really more appropriate for your series next week, but I think we have to kind of question our assumptions that Russia can go on in Syria forever, or Venezuela, or all these places. And they probably can, but I think the strain on the Russian economy to support some of its adventures is not anything will be not like anything we've seen in the past decade.
Well, yeah, no, Don, you're right. I mean, the Russian economy rests on two pillars, oil and gas. And they're both in very deep trouble right now. I haven't looked at the latest oil price, but it's in the 20s, if I'm not mistaken.
25 or whatever, yeah.
People are expecting it could go down into the teens. These are numbers we haven't seen since the 90s. If I'm not mistaken, or early 2000s to the latest. I haven't checked that oil price graph right now, but one has to wonder. I mean, Russia's hard currency reserves are in pretty decent shape right now, but they're not going to last forever.
Which they don't seem willing to spend on a response either.
Which they don't seem willing to spend on a response, but one has to wonder, as oil, I mean, in addition to oil and gas, Russia makes a lot of money from arms sales, and I suspect they will continue to do so. Maria, any thoughts on the economic side of this?
So actually, since I started with the jokes and I want to increase the mood a little bit, there was another joke precisely about the situation. Putin asks the genie, I want to nullify the last 20 years and start from the scratch. I will do that, said the genie, and return the oil prices to $28 as what back in 2000. So that's exactly that same situation. It's not looking good. And once again, when it comes to oil prices, by the way, I wanted to come back to my earlier point about the decision-making in Russia. We know more or less how this decision to break the OPEC deal has been made. It is questionable, once again, whether the deal would have been able to keep the prices a little bit higher or not. but the Saudi reaction has been catastrophic for the Russian market. Especially Russia has stopped selling oil altogether because there's no buyers anymore with this, with the oil prices being so low because of the Saudi. And the decision making has been made totally against any advice received from Russian experts. Essentially by Sechen's decision only. He walked into Putin and he suggested that, and somehow he ended up being quite convincing, and out of nowhere Russia just broke this deal, which also literally like made the oil prices collapse in the end. This is very similar to how we saw the constitutional amendments being implemented. So essentially they originally somewhat tried to preserve some more sophisticated design. Maybe they were considering the state council option that we have discussed in the past, maybe not. But in the end, again, something happened. Maybe someone walked into Putin and they again resorted to the most simple, rude, and honestly illegitimate measure that is going to come haunt the Kremlin in the long term, because that's not viewed as legitimate by many, even Russians, who are really much more tolerant than other countries, than other populations, but still this is a little bit too much. Unfortunately, we kind of see a set of very chaotic decisions ongoing with the coronavirus as well. All of that, I think, needs to be perceived as some fundamental weakening of the Kremlin decision-making. The Kremlin is getting old. It's not responding very well to the crisis, and I think we're going to see more of that as the horrible situation with the coronavirus develops.
And
I would definitely agree, Maria. Definitely.
No, the Saudi oil, the decision on the Saudi oil, I mean, it's a classic case of cutting off your nose to spite your face, I think. I mean, the way this decision was made, in my understanding, was that the Russia kind of was open to acquiescing to what the Saudis wanted because they thought it would undercut the Americans with shale gas. And it certainly has hurt the Americans, but it's hurt the Russians a lot more. And one has to wonder, going back to the Kremlinology of all this, the dark lord of Russian oil, Igor Sechin, you have to wonder what this is going to do to his power base inside the Russian power structures. And this is something
And Brian, this just happened. So this shows how they go caught by surprise by the virus. 2 weeks ago this happened. And so it reinforces Maria's point that the decision-making is faltering or out of touch, or however you want to describe, whatever negative term you want.
All right. Well, on that note, we're bumping up against the clock, so we'll wrap it up because that's all we have time for today. I would like to remind you, you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA, and joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University.
Thanks to you both.
And also joining us from her home in DuPont Circle, down the hill from me in our nation's capital, is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you both for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And, by the way, none of us have haircuts because we can't get haircuts thanks to social media.
On there, yeah. I was going to say we can't.
I have to keep the haircut thing.
Keep the haircut joke, Brian, for another week.
My barber. I promised my barber I'll be back weekly once this is all over. I'd also like to thank our awesome producer Mikhail Harmata for keeping all the sanitized lights and complicated sanitized socially distanced machines well oiled and in working order throughout our socially distanced discussion. I'd also like to remind you, you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Keep washing your hands. Keep using hand sanitizers. Keep practicing social distancing. Do not touch your face. Keep calm and carry on, and join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.